There is a kind of silence that belongs only to very large places. It is not the silence of a closed room or the quiet of a sleeping house. It is bigger than that. It is the silence of open sky, of flat earth stretching to the horizon in every direction, of grass moving slowly in a wind that has travelled hundreds of miles before it reached you. It is the silence of the Russian plain, that immense, ancient, barely touched wilderness that spreads across the eastern half of Europe like a great sleeping giant, breathing slowly under stars that seem sharper and closer here than anywhere else on Earth. Before we begin tonight's story, tell me, where are you listening from? In bed, on the couch, or somewhere else? If these relaxing history videos help you, please give this one a like and subscribe. Let me know in the comments what history you want next. If you had stood on that plain in the early summer of 1812, in some quiet field near the western border of the Russian Empire, where the tall grasses were just beginning to dry in the June heat, you would have felt something extraordinary approaching. The ground beneath your feet would have trembled, very slightly at first, the way the earth trembles when something enormously heavy is moving somewhere far away. The birds in the nearby birch trees would have grown restless, lifting from branch to branch, cocking their small heads to listen. And then, slowly from the west, you would have begun to hear it, a sound that defied easy description, a sound that was not one sound at all, but the blending of hundreds of thousands of individual sounds into something like distant thunder that never quite stopped. The sound of boots on dry earth, hundreds of thousands of boots, the sound of wagon wheels rolling over roads, thousands of wagons, the sound of horses, not dozens of horses, not hundreds, but tens of thousands of horses, their hooves and their breathing and the jingling of their harnesses all woven together into a single enormous sound, low and constant as the sea. This was the Grande Armée, Napoleon's Grand Army, the largest single military force that Europe had ever assembled in one place, marching east into the vast mystery of Russia. Nothing quite like it had ever moved across the face of the earth before. To truly understand what happened in Russia in 1812, to understand why this great army, this magnificent, terrifying collection of soldiers from nearly every nation in Europe, was broken and destroyed in the space of a single year, we must begin not on the battlefield, not in the frost and the snow, but in the long years of confidence and triumph that came before. We must understand what kind of army this was, and what kind of man had built it, before we can understand why it fell. Napoleon Bonaparte was, by the summer of 1812, the most powerful man in the world. He had been born on the island of Corsica in 1769, the son of a minor nobleman, and had risen through the chaos of the French Revolution to become first a general, then a consul, then an emperor. He had won battles that textbooks would still be studying 2 centuries later. He had reorganized the laws of France, restructured its government, and spread French ideas across Europe at the point of a sword. He was brilliant, relentless, endlessly energetic, and possessed of an almost supernatural ability to understand what was happening on a battlefield and respond to it faster than his enemies could think. By 1812, Napoleon ruled, directly or indirectly, over most of continental Europe. His brothers sat on the thrones of Spain, the Netherlands, and Westphalia. His allies controlled large parts of Italy, Germany, and Poland. He had defeated the Austrians multiple times, humiliated the Prussians in a single devastating campaign, and signed treaties with the Russians at Tilsit in 1807 that seemed to make France and Russia partners in reshaping the world. The British, who were his most persistent enemies, could only harry him from the sea, unable to strike at him directly on land. And yet something was wrong between France and Russia. It had been growing wrong for years, slowly and quietly, the way a crack grows in old stone, invisible for a long time, then suddenly everywhere. The problem was the continental system. Napoleon's great plan to defeat Britain economically, to close all European ports to British trade, to strangle the British economy by cutting it off from its customers on the continent. Russia had agreed to this at Tilsit, but the continental system was hurting Russia as much as it hurt Britain. Russian landowners depended on selling grain and timber to Britain. Russian merchants suffered when British goods were banned, and Britain, for its part, had found ways around the blockade anyway, smuggling goods through neutral ships and minor ports, so that Russia was paying a heavy economic price while the system accomplished very little. By 1810, Russia had quietly begun allowing neutral ships carrying British goods to enter its ports. Napoleon was furious. He saw it as a betrayal, a breaking of the sacred alliance, and there were other tensions too, disputes about Poland, about the direction of Russian foreign policy, about Tsar Alexander's ambitions in the West, about Napoleon's seemingly endless expansion. The two emperors, who had once stood on a raft in the middle of a river and embraced each other like brothers, had grown cold and suspicious. Their letters became formal, then curt, then stopped altogether. By 1811, both sides were preparing for war. Napoleon spent nearly a year assembling his army for the Russian campaign, and the scale of what he gathered was unlike anything Europe had seen. From France he called up hundreds of thousands of men. From his allied and subject states he demanded more. Poles who were fiercely loyal to him and dreamed that a French victory might restore their long-lost nation. Germans from Prussia, Saxony, Bavaria, Württemberg, and a dozen other states. Italians from Napoleon's Kingdom of Italy. Dutch, Swiss, Portuguese, Spanish, Croatians, Lithuanians, and Danes. There were even a small number of soldiers from nations as far away as Egypt and the Ottoman Empire, caught up in the vast gravitational pull of Napoleon's wars. At its peak, before losses from sickness and desertion had begun to thin the ranks, the Grand Armée that crossed into Russia numbered somewhere between 610,000 and 680,000 men, depending on how you count the various supporting forces and allied contingents. 600,000 human beings moving together across the face of the earth, accompanied by approximately 180,000 horses for the cavalry, the artillery and the wagons, accompanied by nearly 1,400 artillery pieces, great iron cannons that had to be hauled across every road and river and muddy field, accompanied by thousands of supply wagons, ambulance wagons, ammunition wagons, wagons carrying officers' personal belongings, wagons carrying Napoleon's travelling library, wagons carrying the portable printing press he used to publish military bulletins. The logistics of feeding and supplying such an army were staggering. Each horse needed roughly 10 kilograms of fodder per day. Each man needed roughly a kilogram of bread and a litre of water. Do the mathematics and you realise that simply keeping this army alive required an almost unimaginable daily flow of supplies: food, water, horse feed, ammunition, replacement shoes. Soldiers wore through boots at a surprising rate on long marches, medical supplies, and 1,000 other necessities. Napoleon had thought about this carefully. He had ordered enormous supply depots built along the expected line of march. He had requisitioned thousands of additional wagons to carry reserves of food. He had planned, with his usual meticulous attention to detail, for every contingency he could imagine. What he had not quite imagined, or had not quite allowed himself to imagine, was Russia itself. The Russian Empire in 1812 was immense, truly, almost incomprehensibly immense. It covered 1/6 of the land surface of the entire Earth. From its western border with Poland to the Pacific Ocean was a distance of roughly 11,000 kilometers. From its northern shores in the Arctic to its southern borders in the Caucasus was another several thousand kilometers. It was a land of such extraordinary variety. Frozen tundra in the north, vast steppes in the south, ancient forests of pine and birch stretching for thousands of kilometers in the center. Great rivers like the Volga and the Dnieper and the Don that could swallow the Seine or the Thames without noticing. And it was, in many places, very empty. This is something that is easy to forget when we think about Russia in 1812. We think of it as a European country, a civilized nation, and it was those things. It had cities and universities and fine architecture. It had a sophisticated court and a cultured aristocracy. It had churches of breathtaking beauty and literary traditions of remarkable depth. But it was also vast in a way that Western Europe simply was not. The distances between towns could be enormous. The roads were poor. In dry summer weather they were dusty tracks through the fields. In the autumn rains they became rivers of mud. In winter they disappeared entirely beneath the snow. The forests were deep and old and went on for hundreds of kilometers without a clearing. Russia was a place where armies could get lost. Not metaphorically, but literally, where columns of soldiers could march for days without finding a village to shelter in, where supply wagons could become separated from the main body and never be found again, where the land itself seemed to resist and absorb and quietly swallow up whatever was sent into it. The Russian commanders understood this about their country in a way that no Westerner, no matter how well read or well travelled, could quite grasp from the outside. The land was their ally. It always had been. Tsar Alexander I of Russia was a complicated and somewhat mysterious man. He'd been born in 1777, the grandson of Catherine the Great, and had grown up in the strange hothouse atmosphere of the Russian court, educated by liberal Swiss tutors who taught him about the Enlightenment and the rights of man, surrounded by the Byzantine intrigues of aristocratic politics, watched over by a father, Paul I, who was erratic and sometimes cruel, and who was eventually murdered in a palace coup while Alexander was 23 years old. Whether Alexander knew about the plot to kill his father, or had tacitly approved it, was a question that haunted him for the rest of his life. He had become Tsar at a terrible cost, and he knew it. He was tall, handsome and charming, capable of great warmth in personal encounters, genuinely interested in ideas, possessed of a vague but sincere desire to make Russia a better and more just country. But he was also capable of deep dissimulation, of showing one face in public and thinking another in private. Napoleon, who was not easily fooled by people, found Alexander hard to read and somewhat unsettling. After their first meeting at Tilsit, Napoleon wrote that Alexander had a great deal of intelligence and grace, but one cannot trust him. By 1812, Alexander had made up his mind about Napoleon. The French emperor was not a partner or a fellow sovereign to be dealt with diplomatically. He was an aggressor, an insatiable expansionist who would not stop until he had reduced Russia to a satellite state, just as he had reduced Prussia and Austria and Spain. There could be no more compromise, no more accommodation. If Napoleon came to Russia, Russia would fight, and Russia would not stop fighting, no matter what happened, no matter how badly the army was beaten or how much territory was lost. The Russian people would rise up. The Russian land would resist, and in the end Napoleon would be broken. This was not simply Alexander's private conviction. It was shared by many of the Russian officers and aristocrats who had been watching Napoleon's expansion for a decade. There was a determination, deep and quiet and very serious, that France would find Russia a different kind of opponent than it had found in Austria or Prussia or Spain. One man who embodied this determination more than almost any other was Mikhail Kutuzov, the old Russian general who would eventually be given command of the Russian armies in the field. Kutuzov was 67 years old in 1812, corpulent and apparently slow-moving, apparently half asleep at meetings and councils of war, apparently unimpressed by the sophisticated strategic theories that younger officers debated. But Kutuzov was not asleep. He was watching. He was thinking. And he understood something about how to fight Napoleon that perhaps no one else in Russia quite understood yet. You did not fight him directly, not unless you had to, not until he was already half destroyed. You used the land. You used the distance. You used time. You let the French army exhaust itself marching through the Russian emptiness. And then, when it was stretched thin and hungry and cold and confused, you struck. The Grand Army crossed the Niemen River, the border between the Duchy of Warsaw and the Russian Empire, on June 24th, 1812. Napoleon himself crossed on June 25th, on horseback, watching his great columns file across the pontoon bridges that his engineers had thrown up in a single night. It was a magnificent sight. Tens of thousands of men in their colourful uniforms, the dark blue coats of the French infantry, the gleaming breastplates of the heavy cavalry cuirassiers, the tall bearskin hats of the Imperial Guard, all flowing across the river and spreading out onto the Russian plain beyond. Flags and standards caught the morning breeze. Drums rolled. The cavalry horses tossed their heads and snorted. Napoleon had done this many times before, crossing a border into an enemy country with his army. He knew what came next. Marching to find the enemy's main force, bringing it to battle, winning a decisive engagement, then dictating terms to a defeated government. He had done it in Italy, in Egypt, in Austria, in Prussia. He expected to do it again in Russia. He expected to be finished in about 2 months, to march to Moscow, or perhaps not even that far, to fight 1 or 2 great battles, and then to return west with a new treaty in his pocket. The Russian plains spread out before him, enormous and quiet in the early summer morning. He had no way of knowing that he would never win that decisive battle, that the Russians would never give him the fight he wanted at the time and place of his choosing, that the plain which looked so innocent and open in the June sunlight was waiting for him with a patience older and deeper than any human strategy. The first thing that surprised the Grande Armée about Russia was the emptiness. They had expected resistance at the border, or at least quickly after the crossing. They had expected the Russian army to turn and stand, to offer battle, to behave the way European armies generally behaved when invaded. Instead, the Russian forces retreated. They retreated steadily, carefully, not in panic, but in order, drawing the French further and further east with every day that passed. The second thing that surprised them was the roads, or rather, the lack of roads in any useful sense. The main routes east were unpaved, and in the summer heat they became rivers of fine dust that clogged the soldiers' lungs and coated everything, men, horses, wagons, in a pale grey film. When it rained, which it did sometimes even in the summer, those same roads became rivers of mud, thick and clinging, that grabbed at boot heels and wagon wheels with an almost malicious persistence. Horses slipped and fell. Wagons sank to their axles. A column that had been moving briskly in the morning could slow to a crawl by afternoon. and the distances were simply unlike anything the soldiers had experienced in Western European campaigns. In France, in Germany, in Poland, a great march of 20 or 25 kilometers in a day was considered hard going. In Russia, even 25 kilometers brought you only a tiny fraction of the way to Moscow, and Moscow itself was just the first objective, not the end of the road. The great grey-green plains simply continued day after day, offering no feature to rest the eye, no landmark to indicate progress, nothing but grass and sky and the ever-retreating Russian rearguard. The French soldiers had a name for this sensation. They called it the Russian mirage, the way that the army seemed to be marching endlessly toward a horizon that never got any closer, the way that victory always seemed just one more battle away, and that battle always refused to come. The summer heat was the first great enemy of the Grande Armée, and it is worth spending some time with this part of the story, because it is often overlooked in accounts that focus on the famous Russian winter. June and July of 1812 were unusually hot in Western Russia. The soldiers marching in their wool uniforms, carrying their heavy packs and muskets, suffered terribly in the heat. Heatstroke was common. Exhaustion was universal. Men fell out of the columns by the hundreds, sitting down by the side of the dusty roads to rest, unable to keep up with the relentless pace that Napoleon demanded. Some would catch up the next day. Others would be found still sitting there hours later, unresponsive, their faces red and their breathing laboured. Others simply disappeared, wandered into the forest, were picked off by Cossack patrols, or died quietly in a ditch somewhere in that vast anonymous countryside. The horses suffered even more than the men. The Russian plain did not offer the kind of rich pasture that European horses needed. The grass was different, coarser, less nutritious. The supply of fodder brought from Poland quickly ran low. Horses that had been in magnificent condition when they crossed the Niemen began to lose weight alarmingly, their ribs showing beneath their coats, their strength fading day by day. A horse that is underfed cannot carry a cavalryman effectively. A horse that is starving cannot pull an artillery piece across muddy ground. Within the first few weeks of the campaign, the cavalry, one of the most important arms of any Napoleonic army, was already losing horses at a rate that alarmed the officers responsible for maintaining it. Horses died in the columns, simply dropping where they stood, their legs giving out beneath them. Others were abandoned when they could no longer keep up. The great herds that had crossed the Niemen began to thin, slowly but unmistakably, like a fire burning through available fuel. The supply wagons too were in difficulty. The wagons Napoleon had brought were designed for European roads. On Russian tracks in Russian weather, they broke down with distressing frequency. Axles cracked, wheels collapsed, horses pulling them gave out. The contents had to be redistributed or abandoned. The supply depots that Napoleon had so carefully established before the campaign turned out to be inadequate to the reality of the Russian distances. Food that should have reached the soldiers at a certain point had not arrived. The soldiers improvised, foraging in the surrounding countryside, eating whatever they could find in the villages they passed through. But the Russian countryside had been deliberately stripped. The Russian scorched-earth policy was not an improvised response to the French invasion. It had been discussed and prepared for months before Napoleon crossed the Niemen. Some Russian officers and officials had studied the Swedish campaign of Charles XII, another Western king who had invaded Russia a century before in 1708 and had been destroyed, and had drawn the obvious lesson: don't fight the invader directly. Make the land itself your weapon. As the Russian armies retreated before the French advance, they did not simply leave the countryside intact for the enemy to live off. They burned the crops, They drove away the livestock. They emptied the granaries and mills, carrying away what they could carry and burning the rest. They destroyed bridges behind them, forcing the French to build new ones under fire or detour around rivers. They contaminated wells. They stripped the villages of everything useful: tools, food, fodder, fuel. The result was that the Grande Armée was marching through a landscape that had been quietly emptied of everything an army needed to sustain itself. Villages were deserted, not destroyed in the dramatic sense. The buildings were often still standing, but emptied. The peasants had fled into the forests or the deeper countryside, taking their animals and their stores of food with them. French soldiers entering a village would find the houses standing open, the doors swinging in the wind, the hearths cold, the shelves bare. No bread, no grain, no hay, no chickens or pigs or cows, not even the people themselves. Just empty houses and a strange, heavy silence. This was deeply disorienting for soldiers accustomed to European campaigns, where even in enemy territory you could usually find something to eat. Some peasant who would sell you bread for a few coins, some farm with cattle in the yard. In Russia, there was nothing. The countryside was empty in a way that felt almost supernatural, as if the land itself had swallowed its people and its stores and simply refused to offer anything to the unwanted visitors moving through it. The effect on morale was significant. An army marches on its stomach, as Napoleon himself famously observed. An army that cannot eat becomes anxious, then desperate, then brutal. As food became scarce, French soldiers began to behave in ways that alienated the Russian civilians they encountered, looting not just food but any personal property they found, burning buildings out of frustration or just to keep warm at night, treating the Russian peasantry with a contempt and violence that hardened Russian resistance and helped turn a military conflict into something closer to a people's war. The retreating Russian armies were commanded initially by two generals who were often in fundamental disagreement about what to do. Mikhail Barclay de Tolly was the commander of the First Western Army, the larger of the two main Russian forces. He was a man of Scottish descent whose family had been in Russian service for generations, a careful and intelligent commander who understood perfectly well that retreat was the correct strategy, that allowing Napoleon to force a decisive battle before the Russian armies were united and properly positioned would be catastrophic. He was right in his strategic judgment, but he was unpopular. His cautious retreating earned him the nickname Barclay the Traitor among some Russian officers and much of the public, who wanted to see the French stopped and fought, not constantly chased deeper into their homeland. The second major Russian army was commanded by Prince Pyotr Bagration, a fiery Georgian nobleman who was everything Barclay was not in terms of temperament. Bagration hated retreating. He hated it with a personal, visceral passion. It felt to him like cowardice, like dishonour, like something fundamentally un-Russian. He wrote furious letters to the Tsar complaining about Barclay's endless retreating, demanding that the armies turn and fight. His letters were sometimes intemperate, sometimes unfair to Barclay, but they reflected a feeling that was widespread in the Russian officer corps and in Russian society more broadly. There was a deep tension in Russian strategy that summer, between those who understood that retreat was winning and those who felt that retreat was losing. This tension would not be resolved easily or quickly. It would take weeks of argument and one terrible battle before the logic of the retreat finally became undeniable. The two Russian armies made contact with each other after weeks of marching on parallel lines while the French pursued them near Smolensk, an ancient Russian city on the Dnieper River, one of the oldest cities in all of Russia, a place of great historical and spiritual significance. Smolensk stands on a bend of the Dnieper River, its ancient Kremlin walls rising above the water, its churches and towers visible from many kilometers away. In 1812, it was a city of perhaps 15,000 people, known throughout Russia for the beauty of its Assumption Cathedral and for its importance as a crossroads between East and West. Russian armies had defended it against Poles and Swedes and Lithuanians over the centuries. Its walls had seen siege and fire and reconquest. It was, in a very real sense, one of the guardian cities of the Russian interior. When the French reached Smolensk in mid-August, they expected the Russians to stand and fight for it. And indeed, the Russian armies did fight, for one day and most of another night, in one of the most intense urban battles of the entire campaign. The French threw themselves against the city's walls and gates with tremendous ferocity. The Russians inside, first Nikolai Raevski's corps, then Dokhturov's, defended every building, every street, every church tower with equal ferocity. The fighting in Smolensk was brutal in a way that shocked even veterans of other Napoleonic battles. The streets were narrow and the buildings were old and solidly built. Artillery fire smashed walls and set roofs on fire. Smoke filled the air until it was impossible to see more than a few meters in any direction. Men fought hand to hand in doorways and on stairways, fighting for single rooms of single buildings, with a desperation that reflected how much this place meant to the Russians defending it. And then, when it became clear that the city could not be held indefinitely, that French numbers would eventually overwhelm the defenders, the Russian commanders made a decision that stunned the watching soldiers on both sides. They set Smolensk on fire themselves and withdrew. The fires were started by Russian soldiers and by panicked civilians in the night. By the time the French entered the city on the morning of August 18th, much of Smolensk was burning. The Great Assumption Cathedral survived, protected by its massive stone construction, but thousands of wooden houses were consumed. The city that Napoleon entered was largely a shell, still smoking, its streets covered with ash and the debris of burned buildings, its wells usable but its stores of food and fodder gone. It was a profound moment. The French had taken a major Russian city, the first genuinely important city to fall into their hands, but it was a ruined city, a gift of ashes. Napoleon stood in the ruins of Smolensk and understood, for perhaps the first time, that this campaign was not going the way he had intended. He had expected a decisive battle before this point, some great clash of armies that would end with the Russians defeated and suing for peace. It had not happened. Instead, the Russian armies had slipped away again, retreating further east, burning what they left behind, leaving Napoleon holding nothing but rubble and smoke. Some of his marshals urged him to stop here, to establish a defensive line, to winter in Smolensk, to continue the campaign in the spring when the army would be rested and resupplied. Napoleon rejected this advice. He was convinced that one more victory, one more push east, would bring Alexander to the negotiating table. The Russian army must be caught and destroyed. Moscow must be taken, and the campaign must be won this year, because he could not afford to spend a winter in Russia, could not leave such a large army so far from France for so long. He marched east from Smolensk on August 25th. The road to Moscow from Smolensk runs roughly east, northeast through increasingly dense forest and across several rivers, the Dnieper giving way to smaller tributaries, the landscape becoming, if anything, more enclosed and harder to read than the open plains further west. For a week and more the French army marched, and the Russians retreated, and nothing resolved. And then, about 70 kilometers west of Moscow, on a flat plain near a village called Borodino, the Russians stopped. There had been enormous pressure on the new Russian commander, Kutuzov, who'd been appointed to replace Barclay de Tolly in late August, after the loss of Smolensk had made the old general politically untenable, to stand and fight before Moscow. The Tsar wanted it. The army wanted it. Russian public opinion, such as it was in 1812, was demanding it. Moscow could not simply be surrendered without a battle. The city was the ancient capital, the holy city, the heart of Russia, in every symbolic and emotional sense that the Russian people understood. To give it up without a fight would be a wound to Russian pride and Russian identity that might prove politically unsustainable. Kutuzov understood all of this. He did not want to fight at Borodino. Not really. Not from pure military logic. He knew that a direct engagement with Napoleon's army, even a Russian army fighting on home ground, was enormously risky. Napoleon was at his best in pitched battles. His tactical genius, his ability to read a battlefield and strike at the decisive point, had won him engagement after engagement against armies that outnumbered or were at least equal to his own. But there was no choice. Kutuzov chose his ground carefully. A broad plateau between the Kolocha River to the north and thick forest to the south, with several villages and a great earthwork redoubt, a fortified artillery position in the centre, and he prepared his men to fight. The Battle of Borodino was fought on September the 7th, 1812. It was the bloodiest single day of combat in all the Napoleonic Wars, and one of the bloodiest single days of battle in all of recorded European history up to that point. The French attacked at dawn. To describe the Battle of Borodino in its full detail would require a book of its own. Many books have been written about it, including some of the most beautiful passages in Tolstoy's War and Peace, that great novel which circles around this battle like a planet around a sun. But to understand the campaign, we must understand something of what happened there. Napoleon had roughly 130,000 men available for the battle. Kutuzov had roughly 120,000, plus perhaps 30,000 more who were irregular militia troops of limited military value. The two armies were thus roughly matched in size, though Napoleon's army, veterans of many campaigns, was probably somewhat superior in training and experience. The battle began with a massive French artillery bombardment, more than 600 guns opening fire simultaneously in the early morning, a sound that could be heard from 60 kilometers away, a rolling continuous thunder that shook the ground and filled the sky with smoke. Through this smoke, French infantry advanced in great columns toward the Russian positions, the famous earthwork redoubts and gun emplacements that Kutuzov had spent several days preparing. The Russians defended with extraordinary courage and ferocity. The battle lasted from about 6 in the morning until the light failed in the early evening. 12 hours of almost continuous fighting across a battlefield roughly 4 kilometers wide and 3 kilometers deep. Every hour brought fresh horrors. The great central redoubt changed hands several times, each assault and counter-assault costing hundreds of lives. Prince Bagration was mortally wounded early in the fighting, a cannonball fragment shattering his leg, and was carried from the field, dying of his wound 9 days later. The loss of this beloved and fiery general was felt through the whole army. Toward the end of the day, Napoleon was urged by his marshals to commit the Imperial Guard, his elite reserve force, the finest troops in the army, held back thus far from the fighting. Committing the Guard at the right moment might have broken the Russian line completely and turned a contested battle into a decisive victory. Napoleon hesitated. He looked at the Guard, those incomparable veterans, those tall men in their bearskin hats who had never lost a battle, and he could not quite bring himself to risk them, so far from France, so far from help, with the Russian army still intact and dangerous. He refused to commit the guard. The opportunity, if it existed at all, passed. When the sun set over Borodino, the French held the Russian redoubts and had pushed the Russian line somewhat further east than it had been in the morning. But the Russian army had not broken. It had retreated in order, under command, still capable of fighting. And the cost to the French had been enormous, roughly 30,000 French and Allied soldiers killed or wounded in a single day. The Russians had lost perhaps 40,000 men killed or wounded. Together, more than 70,000 human beings had become casualties in the space of 12 hours on that quiet plateau. That night, as the Russian army withdrew east toward Moscow and the French held the battlefield, the field itself was a scene of quiet but terrible devastation. Tens of thousands of wounded men lay where they had fallen, unable to move, calling out for water in a dozen different languages. The horses, thousands of horses, lay among them or stumbled on broken legs or wandered through the darkness in confusion. Fires burned where artillery had set the dry grass alight. The moon rose over all of this and illuminated it with a cold, impartial light. Kutuzov withdrew east through the night and through the next day, and on September 13th he held a council of war in the village of Fili, just outside Moscow. The choice before him was stark: turn and fight again to defend Moscow, with an army that had been badly battered at Borodino and had not had time to rest or rebuild, or withdraw further east, abandoning Moscow, saving the army. In that small peasant house in Fili, with the generals sitting around a table and the lamplight steady on their faces, Kutuzov listened to the arguments. Several of his officers could not bear the idea of surrendering Moscow without another fight. The city meant too much, historically, symbolically, emotionally. To give it up without more resistance felt unthinkable. But Kutuzov had made up his mind. He spoke quietly and with great certainty. Russia was not Moscow. An army that preserved itself could fight again. An army destroyed defending a city could not. The war would continue. The army would march east and south, away from Moscow, resting and rebuilding, receiving reinforcements, waiting. The city would be given up. The council ended. The order went out. The Russian army would abandon Moscow. What followed was one of the most extraordinary scenes of the entire campaign: the evacuation of Moscow. The news that the army was abandoning the city spread through Moscow's population overnight. What followed was a mass exodus. Tens of thousands of people, the great majority of the city's approximately 270,000 inhabitants, leaving their homes and taking to the roads with whatever they could carry. In carts and carriages, on horseback and on foot, carrying children and bundled possessions and livestock, the people of Moscow streamed out of their city in a great human river, heading east into the Russian interior. An observer watching from the road would have seen an almost unimaginable spectacle. The wealthy aristocracy with their carriages and their servants, their furniture loaded onto wagons, their paintings wrapped in cloth and stacked in the carts. The merchant families with their inventories of goods, choosing desperately between what could be saved and what must be abandoned. The ordinary people carrying whatever they could in their arms, some of them weeping, most of them silent with a kind of stunned acceptance. The Russian commander of Moscow, Count Rostopchin, was organizing something else at the same time. He had decided, apparently in consultation with other Russian officials and perhaps with the Tsar's implicit approval, that Moscow would be burned, not accidentally. not as a side effect of battle, deliberately, systematically set on fire by Russian agents moving through the city as the last Russian troops left and before the French entered. The burning of Moscow began on the night of September 14th, 1812. Napoleon entered Moscow on September 14th, riding at the head of his army through the Dorogomilov Gate. He expected to be greeted by a deputation of city officials, by a formal surrender, by the keys to the city, the ancient ceremonial ritual that marked the fall of a great place. Conquered cities did this. It was how it was done. No deputation came, no officials appeared, no keys were presented. Napoleon waited. He waited for hours, growing confused and then irritated and then alarmed. Something was wrong. The city was almost empty of people. The streets were deserted. The great bazaars and market squares where, in normal times, thousands of people jostled and argued and traded were silent. The windows of the houses were dark. Moscow, this great city of 250,000 souls, had been emptied. And then, in the evening, the first fires appeared. They started in several places simultaneously, a clear sign that they were not accidental. The wind, which was strong that night, carried the flames from building to building with frightening speed. Moscow in 1812 was a city built largely of wood. Wooden houses, wooden shops, wooden warehouses, wooden fences, wooden everything. It burned magnificently and terribly. By the second night, much of the city was ablaze. Napoleon, who had established his headquarters in the great Kremlin palace at the centre of the city, was awoken in the small hours and told that the Kremlin itself was in danger. He was led out of the building and through burning streets, he and his small escort picking their way through walls of flame, stepping over burning debris, their faces lit orange by the fires on every side, until they reached safety outside the city. The scale of the destruction was staggering. When the fires finally burned themselves out after several days, somewhere between 2/3 and 3/4 of Moscow had been destroyed. The stone churches and the Kremlin survived, protected by their masonry. But the great swathes of wooden housing that made up most of the city were gone. The granaries and warehouses and shops, the supplies that Napoleon had hoped to use to sustain his army through the winter, were ash. The city that the French had marched so far to capture was a ruin. Napoleon stood in the Kremlin and looked out over the smouldering remnants of the greatest city in Russia and tried to understand what had happened to him. He had planned to winter in Moscow. He had expected to find food and supplies for his army in the city's vast storehouses. He had expected that taking Moscow would bring Alexander to the table, that the Russian Tsar, humiliated by the loss of his ancient capital, would send negotiators and sue for peace. None of this happened. Alexander did not send negotiators. He had retreated to St. Petersburg, hundreds of kilometers to the north, and was receiving the news of Moscow's fall with a face of fixed, almost supernatural calm. He wrote letters to his generals, to his allies, to the Russian people. He would not negotiate. He would not accept peace. The war would continue. Moscow was a tragedy, but Russia was not Moscow. Russia would fight. Napoleon wrote letters to Alexander. He sent emissaries. He tried every diplomatic channel available to him. Nothing worked. The Tsar simply did not respond. The days passed in the burned city. The French army occupied what was left of Moscow. Quartered in the stone churches and the surviving aristocratic palaces and the cellars of ruined buildings, they found some food in undestroyed cellars and warehouses. They found enormous quantities of wine in the great merchant houses. They found furs, silk, silver, gold, the accumulated luxury of one of the wealthiest cities in Europe, much of it abandoned in the rush to evacuate. The soldiers looted systematically and comprehensively, turning Moscow into a vast treasure house being slowly emptied. But they did not find enough food. Not nearly enough to sustain 100,000 men through a Russian winter. And the Russian winter was coming. Anyone who has experienced a Russian winter knows that the phrase cold is inadequate. The Russian winter is not simply cold in the way that a winter in Germany or France or England is cold. It is a different category of cold entirely. A cold that seems to have a personality, that feels purposeful and hostile, that operates with a methodical thoroughness that no amount of warm clothing can quite defeat. October in Moscow can be pleasant. It is the season of the golden autumn, the famous Russian-Indian summer, when the birch trees turn to gold, and the light is soft and clear, and the air is cool but not yet cruel. Napoleon and his army enjoyed some of this. The weeks in Moscow were, in terms of physical comfort if nothing else, relatively bearable. But October gives way to November, and November is a different matter entirely. The first serious frosts come in October in the Russian interior, and by November they are regular and increasingly severe. By December, temperatures in the Moscow region routinely drop to -20, -30 degrees Celsius, temperatures at which metal becomes brittle, water freezes solid in seconds, flesh exposed to the wind begins to die within minutes, and in 1812 the winter came early. By late October there were hard frosts at night. By early November the first snows had fallen. Napoleon had spent 5 weeks in Moscow waiting for Alexander to negotiate. On October 18th he gave the order to begin the retreat. The French retreat from Moscow began with a strange quality of order that would not last. Napoleon left Moscow on October 19th with an army of approximately 100,000 men, greatly reduced from the 450,000 or so who had reached Moscow. Hundreds of thousands had fallen out from sickness, exhaustion, battle, and desertion during the advance. He took enormous amounts of loot from the city. The wagons were heavy with silver, gold, paintings, furniture, and captured Russian war trophies. He also stripped the Kremlin churches of some of their valuables, including a great cross from the tower of Ivan the Great. The army moved south from Moscow, trying to reach the more fertile and less devastated regions to the south before turning west for home. But on October 24th, at the town of Maloyaroslavets, the Russians blocked the way. Another fierce battle was fought. The town changed hands 8 times in a single day, and when it was over, the French still held Maloyaroslavets, but the road south was blocked by the main Russian army under Kutuzov. Napoleon did not want to fight Kutuzov's full army again. Not here, not now. He turned his army west, back onto the road it had come east on, the same road that had been stripped and burned and emptied of everything useful on the advance. This decision, to retreat on the old road rather than fight through to the new one, was arguably the moment when the retreat became a catastrophe. The road west was known, and what was known about it was terrible. It had been stripped. The towns along it had been burned. The bridges had been destroyed. There was nothing to eat. The army was marching back through a landscape it had already emptied, and the winter was closing in behind them. The retreat from Moscow is one of the great catastrophes in military history. It is also, in a strange way, one of the great human stories, because within the catastrophe were tens of thousands of individual stories of endurance and courage and despair and occasional grace, stories of men and women and children caught up in forces far beyond their control, doing what human beings always do in extremity, trying to survive, trying to help each other, failing sometimes and succeeding sometimes, reaching for dignity even when dignity was nearly impossible to maintain. The road west from Moscow in November 1812 was a river of humanity stretching back for dozens of kilometres. Soldiers, officers, camp followers, the women and children and traders and servants who'd accompanied the army on the advance and were now trapped with it in the retreat. Wounded men who could not be carried in wagons because there were not enough wagons. Frostbitten men who could barely walk, but walked anyway, because stopping meant freezing to death. The cold was the constant, overwhelming fact of everything. In the first days of November, temperatures began to drop dramatically. By the second week of November, they were regularly reaching -20 or -25 degrees Celsius during the day and -30 or colder at night. The wind, which came from the east and northeast, carried the cold through every layer of clothing the soldiers wore, through their thin French infantry overcoats that had been designed for European winters, through the layers of looted Russian fur they had wrapped around themselves in Moscow, through everything. The problem was not simply the temperature. The problem was the combination of cold, hunger, exhaustion, and constant movement. A soldier who is hungry and exhausted has no reserves to draw on against the cold. His body, which should be burning fuel to stay warm, has no fuel. He shivers, and then he shivers more violently, and then the shivering stops, which is not a good sign, not at all a good sign, because when the shivering stops it means the body has given up trying to fight the cold and has entered the process that ends in death. Frostbite took fingers and toes and ears and noses. Men who had been wounded in earlier fighting could not have their wounds properly treated. The combination of infection and cold was frequently fatal. Men who fell down in the snow from exhaustion, from a moment of dizziness, from a stumble on the ice, often could not get up again. Their companions, themselves barely able to walk, often couldn't help them. They were left where they fell. The snow covered them quietly and quickly. The horses died in enormous numbers. This is a fact that deserves its own moment of quiet attention, because the death of the horses was both a practical catastrophe and a kind of emblem of the whole terrible story. The cavalry horses, the artillery horses, the wagon horses, all of them were suffering from the combination of cold, starvation, and overwork that killed the soldiers. But horses have one additional vulnerability that men do not. They cannot walk on ice. A horse on an icy road is a horse that is going to fall, and when a horse falls, 300 or 400 kilograms of animal, it often breaks its legs. In normal circumstances, a horse with a broken leg can be treated or painlessly killed. On this retreat, in this cold, in this chaos, there was no time for either. The horse was simply left, sometimes calling out in the extraordinary way that injured horses call out as the column moved past it. Horses that died, from cold or starvation or broken legs or any other cause, were immediately butchered and eaten by the nearby soldiers. This was not cruelty but simple necessity. A dead horse was one of the only reliable sources of food available on the retreat road. Men ate their horses raw sometimes, cutting the flesh directly from the still warm carcass, because there was no time to build a fire, and because the marrow in the bones was warm and fed something the cold body desperately needed. As the horses died, the artillery pieces they had been pulling had to be abandoned. One by one, then dozens by dozens, then hundreds by hundreds, the great iron cannons that Napoleon had brought all the way from France and Poland were left by the side of the road. Some were spiked first, the touch hole filled with lead, the gun rendered permanently inoperable, as military regulations required. Many were simply abandoned intact, because there was no time and no strength for anything more. The loss of the artillery was not just a practical military problem, it was a symbol. Napoleon's artillery was one of the sources of his military dominance. It was what won him battles, and here it was, rusting in the Russian snow. The Cossacks never let the retreating army rest. The Cossacks were the light cavalry of the Russian steppe, horsemen of the Don and Kuban and Ural rivers who'd been fighting on horseback for generations, who knew how to ride in any weather, who could appear from nowhere and disappear again before anyone could react. They were not the regulars of the Russian army. They were something older and wilder and in many ways more dangerous. They rode small, incredibly tough horses that didn't need the care that Western cavalry horses required. They could travel vast distances in terrible weather, and they were utterly pitiless to straggling French soldiers. The Cossacks operated mainly on the flanks and at the tail of the retreating French column. They would appear in force at the edge of the forest or out of the swirling snow, whooping and screaming, their swords and lances glittering, and fall upon the soldiers who had fallen behind the main body. The sick, the frostbitten, the simply exhausted. A soldier who fell out of the column was often dead within the hour, cut down by Cossacks before he could get back to his feet. But the Cossacks did something almost as damaging as killing in the long run. They prevented the French from foraging. Any party of soldiers that strayed too far from the main column in search of food risked being surrounded and annihilated by Cossacks who seemed to materialize from the empty white landscape without warning. The result was that the main body of the army had to stay together, moving in a dense, slow-moving mass along the road, unable to spread out and search for food in the surrounding countryside. Kutuzov's regular army paralleled the retreat, staying close enough to threaten but not so close as to force a full engagement. This was deliberate strategy. Kutuzov, who has been criticized by some historians for not doing more to destroy the French army on the retreat, understood something profound. Napoleon's army was destroying itself. Every day that passed without a major battle was a day in which cold and hunger and the road did the work more efficiently than any battle could. Kutuzov was preserving his own men for the battles that would come after Russia, the battles in Germany and France that would ultimately end Napoleon's empire. He was not merely winning the campaign, he was thinking about the war. The crossing of the Berezina River was the worst single episode of the entire retreat. The Berezina is a tributary of the Dnieper, roughly 300 kilometers west of Moscow, and it flows roughly north-south across the retreat route. When Napoleon's army reached it in late November, they had expected to find it frozen solid, a bridge of ice across which the army could simply march. Instead, there had been a brief thaw, and the river was running, its banks covered in semi-melted slush, the current swift and cold. There were no bridges standing. The Russians had destroyed them, and to make matters dramatically worse, the Russian army had managed to get significant forces on the western bank of the river, threatening to cut the retreat route entirely. Napoleon faced the possibility of his army being caught between the Berezina River and the pursuing Russian forces, trapped, cornered, destroyed. What followed was one of the most dramatic engineering achievements in military history, combined with one of the most terrible human tragedies. Napoleon's engineer corps, under General Eblé, built 2 bridges across the Berezina. Not wooden plank bridges across a frozen river, but proper trestle bridges across a flowing, debris-choked river, built by men standing in the freezing water up to their waists or chests, working with numb hands on the wooden beams and supports, men falling and being swept away by the current as they worked, others taking their places. Eblé and his pontonniers, his bridge builders, worked through an entire night and most of the next day, and when they were finished, 2 bridges spanned the Berezina, each roughly 100 meters long. It was a near miraculous achievement under the circumstances. The army began to cross on November 26th. The combat troops went first, the fighting men who were needed on the other bank to hold off the Russian forces that were pressing from the west. For those who crossed in the first day, the bridges held and the crossing was managed, if not easily, then at least successfully. But behind the fighting troops came the enormous mass of non-combat followers, the sick, the wounded, the thousands of civilians and camp followers who had attached themselves to the army. And this mass did not cross in the first day. They waited on the east bank of the river, huddled in the snow, cold and frightened, watching the bridges and hoping. On the morning of November 28th, with tens of thousands of people still on the east bank, the Russian army arrived in force. Artillery opened fire on the crowded bridge approaches. The mass of people, already cold and desperate and beyond reason in many cases, surged toward the bridges. The bridges were narrow. They had taken terrible punishment from the crossing of artillery and wagons and horses. They were failing. One bridge collapsed under a load of wagons. What followed was a scene of such horror that survivors would struggle for the rest of their lives to find words for it. Thousands of people were still on the east bank when the bridges became unusable. Thousands threw themselves into the icy river, trying to swim across. Almost none of them made it. The current was too strong, the water too cold, the far bank too steep. When the Russian army reached the crossing point, they found the east bank covered with the bodies of those who'd not made it, dead from the cold, dead from the crush of the crowd, dead in the river. How many died at the Berezina crossing? The numbers are uncertain and debated. Some estimates say 25,000, others say more. Of the tens of thousands who were still on the east bank when the bridges went down, only a fraction survived. General Eble, who had built the bridges, had wept as he watched the crossing. He had begged the non-combat followers to cross in the first night, when the bridges were still sound. Many had refused. They were too exhausted, too cold, too numb with despair to move. He had known what would happen. He survived the retreat, but not for long. He died in December 1812, his health broken by the campaign. He was 53 years old. He had done something extraordinary and terrible, built a bridge that saved much of an army, only to see it become the frame for one of the great catastrophes of the whole war. His story is one of hundreds, perhaps thousands, of individual stories of the 1812 retreat in which personal heroism and institutional catastrophe were inseparably mixed. West of the Berezina, the retreat continued and the cold intensified. December brought temperatures that even Russian old-timers found remarkable. In the first weeks of December, temperatures in Belarus and Western Russia dropped to -30, -35 degrees Celsius, with wind chills that pushed the effective temperature lower still. This was cold that went beyond mere discomfort into something that functioned like a physical attack. Cold that penetrated instantly through every layer of clothing, that seized the lungs with each breath, that turned exposed skin first white and then black, that killed with a terrible efficiency. The army was no longer an army in any meaningful military sense. It was a mass of suffering human beings, moving west because west was the direction of home, and there was no other reason to move at all. The discipline that had been the distinctive feature of Napoleon's armies, that extraordinary combination of military training and personal loyalty to the emperor that had made the Grande Armée what it was, had largely dissolved. Officers had lost control of their men. Men had lost sight of their companions. The column moved in a kind of dazed, exhausted, almost automated way, each individual reduced to the most basic of all human imperatives: Keep moving, keep moving, keep moving. Napoleon himself travelled much of the retreat in his carriage, muffled in furs, watching the passing columns from his window. What he saw must have been almost unbearable, even for a man of his controlled temperament. These were his soldiers. He had led them from triumph to triumph across Europe, and now they were dying in the snow of a country that simply refused to be conquered. He left the army on December the 5th, handing command to Murat and riding ahead in a post-chaise, covering the distance to Warsaw and then Paris with extraordinary speed. There were political reasons for this. A coup had been attempted in Paris in October, and his presence in France was necessary. But it was also, one senses, a final acknowledgement that there was nothing more he could do for the army. The campaign was over. The army was broken. He needed to get back to France and begin rebuilding. The last surviving organised units of the Grande Armée crossed back into the territory of the Duchy of Warsaw in the third week of December 1812. They had left Russia with roughly 100,000 men in October. They were returning with perhaps 10,000 men still carrying weapons. Some accounts say even fewer, as few as 5,000 fully effective combat soldiers. The rest had been killed, captured, frozen, or simply lost somewhere in the vast Russian winter. The men who returned were barely recognizable as soldiers. They were wrapped in rags, in torn cloaks, in whatever they had found to cover themselves. Their boots had worn out weeks ago, and they had wrapped their feet in pieces of torn uniform, in strips of horsehide, in anything they could find. Many were frostbitten, with blackened fingers and toes and ears. Their faces were gaunt and hollow-eyed, their cheeks sunken, their eyes carrying something in them that people who saw them would never quite forget. A look of having seen something that most human beings are not meant to see. Of the roughly 610,000 men who had entered Russia in June 1812, fewer than 100,000 would return alive. Perhaps as many as 380,000 died during the campaign, killed in battle, dead of disease, frozen to death, drowned at the Berezina, or simply missing in the vast Russian interior, their fates unknown. Another 150,000 or more were captured at various points and spent years as prisoners of war in Russia. Tens of thousands of horses had perished. Virtually all of the artillery had been lost. It was the greatest military disaster in European history since the fall of Rome. Now, having followed the army through its terrible journey, it is worth pausing and looking more carefully at the specific strategies, the specific choices, the specific forces that together produced this outcome. Because the destruction of the Grande Armée was not simply an accident of weather. It was the result of a combination of Russian strategy, Russian endurance, Russian geography, and Napoleon's own miscalculations, each element reinforcing the others, each playing its necessary role in the final catastrophe. Russia's military strategy in 1812 was, in broad outline, a strategy of avoidance and attrition. The Russian commanders, first Barclay de Tolly, then Kutuzov, consistently refused to give Napoleon the decisive battle he needed. They retreated, and in retreating, they forced Napoleon to advance. Every kilometre that Napoleon advanced into Russia made his supply lines longer, made his army larger relative to the distances it needed to defend, made the problems of feeding and supplying and moving his enormous force more acute. This is a point that deserves careful emphasis, because it runs counter to our usual idea of military success. In European military culture, in most military cultures, retreat is failure. Standing and fighting is success. But in the Russian context of 1812, retreat was the most intelligent possible response to Napoleon's invasion, and the generals who urged fighting, The Bagratians, the firebrands who wanted to stand at every river and road, were wrong, however brave they were. Barclay de Tolly, who was accused of cowardice and treachery, was doing exactly the right thing, even though the right thing was deeply unpopular. The scorched earth policy, the burning of crops, the driving away of livestock, the emptying of villages, was equally calculated and equally painful. It required Russians to destroy their own property, their own livelihoods, their own homes. Peasant farmers who had spent years building up their small stores of grain, who had their horses and cattle as the foundations of their modest prosperity, were asked to abandon or destroy everything and flee. Many did so willingly, understanding that a French army living off their lands was a worse outcome than burning those lands. Others had to be compelled by Russian authorities, some resistfully, some weeping. The cost to the Russian population was enormous, and often unremarked in accounts that focus on the military story. But the scorched earth worked. It worked precisely because Russia was so large and the French army was so big. A smaller army might have been able to carry sufficient supplies to sustain itself through the Russian distances. A smaller army might have been able to live off whatever the Russian countryside retained despite the scorching. But an army of 600,000 men cannot carry enough food. It must live off the land, and when the land has been emptied, it starves. The role of the Russian climate deserves its own extended examination, because it was not simply the Russian winter, in the simple sense that phrase implies. The climate was the Great Armée's enemy throughout the campaign, not just in the retreat. In the summer, it was the heat. Unusually hot weather in June and July 1812 killed soldiers and horses that would otherwise have survived, exhausted men who might otherwise have been vigorous, and contributed to the breakdown of the supply system by making the roads worse and the animals weaker. In the autumn, it was the mud. The Russian autumn rains, the Rasputitsa, the season of mud, turned the unpaved roads into channels of thick clay mud that could literally stop an army in its tracks. Wagons sank. Horses were ruined. Progress slowed to a crawl. The Rasputitsa of September and October 1812 added enormously to the suffering of both the advance and the retreat, and it has not received nearly as much attention as the winter that followed. And then there was the winter itself, that deep, killing cold that descended in November and reached its terrible nadir in December. The cold that froze the rivers and made them passable in some places, but also made the roads ice slides on which horses fell and wagons crashed. The cold that could kill an exposed man in 2 hours. The cold that made every other misery worse, wounds that would not heal, feet that were already blistered and worn from marching, hunger that stripped the body's defences against the temperature. The French army was not equipped for a Russian winter. This is a fact that is often presented as a failure of planning on Napoleon's part, and there is some truth to this. He had not ordered Russian weight winter clothing for his men. He had not prepared for the possibility of spending a winter campaign in Russia. But it would be somewhat unfair to blame this entirely on Napoleon. The assumption on both sides in the summer of 1812 was that the campaign would be decided quickly, in a matter of weeks or a few months at most. No army of the era brought full winter equipment on a summer campaign, because summer campaigns were not supposed to last until winter. What was a failure of planning was the failure to turn back earlier. Napoleon's decision to continue advancing to Moscow after Smolensk, against the advice of several of his marshals, extended the campaign into the autumn and ultimately trapped the army in Moscow as winter arrived. If he had stopped at Smolensk and wintered there, the outcome might have been very different. Not a victory, perhaps, but not this catastrophe. The decision to go on, to push for Moscow, to keep believing that one more stroke would bring Alexander to the table, was perhaps the most consequential error of Napoleon's career. The Cossacks deserve their own extended account, because their contribution to the destruction of the Grande Armée was unique and irreplaceable. The Cossacks were not, strictly speaking, part of the regular Russian imperial army. They were semi-independent peoples of the steppe, organized into host communities along the great rivers of southern Russia, the Don, the Kuban, the Ural, the Terek. They had their own traditions, their own leaders, their own ways of war that predated the Russian Empire and would outlast Napoleon by generations. They were horsemen of extraordinary skill, their entire culture and economy built around the horse, and they could do things on horseback that Western cavalry could not imagine. In the 1812 campaign, the Cossacks served as the eyes and ears of the Russian army, as a screening force on the flanks and rear, and as a constant harassment force against the French. They were particularly effective in the autumn and winter, when the cold that was killing the French soldiers barely inconvenienced them. They were accustomed to winter on the steppe, they had warm clothing adapted to it, and their horses were tough little animals bred for exactly this kind of weather and this kind of movement. The great Cossack commander of the campaign was Matvei Platov, the hetman, leader of the Don Cossacks, a man of enormous physical toughness and personal magnetism, who seems to have been perpetually everywhere at once, his horsemen appearing at one point of the French column, then another, never allowing the enemy to feel safe, never allowing the straggling and the falling back to stop. Platov's Cossacks were responsible for thousands of French soldiers being captured or killed, who might otherwise have made it back to the west. The psychological effect of the Cossacks on the retreating French was perhaps as important as their physical impact. The Cossacks were everywhere and nowhere. They came out of nowhere and disappeared into the forest or the snow. They made the French feel that they were surrounded, watched, hunted, which they were. The fear of Cossacks permeated the retreat, adding a constant edge of terror to the physical miseries of cold and hunger. The partisans were another dimension of Russian resistance that is sometimes overlooked. When Napoleon's army marched east through Russia, it passed through thousands of villages and towns, and in many of these places, especially where French soldiers had behaved badly, looting and burning, a quiet but fierce resistance arose. Peasant men who had never fought in their lives organized themselves into small partisan bands, armed with whatever came to hand: axes, hunting rifles, pitchforks, captured French weapons, and began attacking isolated French patrols and foraging parties. The most famous of the Russian partisan commanders was Denis Davidov, a cavalry officer who had requested permission to operate behind French lines with a small force of regular hussars and Cossacks, conducting guerrilla operations against French supply lines and communications. Davidov was brilliantly effective, destroying supply convoys, capturing couriers, ambushing small units, and generally making the French rear areas into a constantly dangerous place. But alongside Davidov's organized partisan band, dozens of spontaneous peasant resistance groups sprang up across the occupied areas. These groups operated independently, without coordination or formal organization, guided simply by the impulse to protect their homes and families and to make the invaders pay for what they had taken and destroyed. They were cruel sometimes, as all irregular warfare tends toward cruelty. French soldiers captured by peasant partisans were not always treated according to the laws of war, but they were effective. They made the French feel surrounded not just by the Russian army but by the Russian people, by a whole country that had risen against them, that offered them no shelter and no mercy, that saw them as invaders to be destroyed rather than soldiers to be defeated. The international character of the Grande Armée is one of the most remarkable and often overlooked aspects of the 1812 campaign, and it deserves careful attention. Napoleon had assembled soldiers from more than 20 different nations for his Russian campaign. Among the most significant in terms of numbers were the Poles, roughly 100,000 of them, organised into the core of the Grand Duchy of Warsaw, fighting with a ferocious commitment that reflected their desperate hope that a French victory would restore the Polish nation that had been partitioned out of existence in the late 18th century. The Poles suffered enormously in Russia, particularly at the Berezina crossing, which happened to fall near what had been historically Polish territory. Their sacrifice in Napoleon's service was immense and would be long remembered. The Germans from Prussia, Saxony, Bavaria, and the other confederation of the Rhine states formed another enormous contingent. Many of them were fighting with less enthusiasm than the Poles, having been pressed into service as part of their nation's obligations to the French alliance, rather than from any genuine commitment to Napoleon's cause. The Prussian corps, commanded by General York, would in December 1812 conclude a separate armistice with the Russians, the Convention of Tauroggen, signed on December 30th, that marked the beginning of Prussia's defection from Napoleon's alliance and would have enormous consequences for the next 2 years of European history. The Westphalians, the Dutch, the Swiss, the Italians, the Croats, the Portuguese, the Spanish. All of these contingents fought in Russia and all suffered terrible losses. The Spanish and Portuguese soldiers in particular found themselves in the grotesque position of being forced to fight for the man who was simultaneously conquering their homelands. Their reluctance and low morale was notorious throughout the campaign. And there were the Lithuanians, the soldiers of the temporary Lithuanian government that Napoleon had established on captured territory, who fought with the awareness that if the French lost, Russian power would return to their homeland with terrible vengeance. The multinational character of the army was both a source of strength and a source of weakness. Napoleon's ability to draw military manpower from across his empire gave him the numbers to assemble the largest army in European history. But an army of 20 nationalities, speaking a dozen languages, fighting for a dozen different reasons, was inherently difficult to hold together under the strains of a catastrophic campaign. As the retreat ground on and the conditions worsened, the non-French contingents tended to dissolve first, their soldiers deserting in larger numbers, losing cohesion more quickly, protecting their own national units at the expense of the larger army. By the time the army reached Poland in December, many of the Allied contingents had essentially ceased to exist as organised military forces. The experiences of individual soldiers, preserved in memoirs and letters and diaries that have survived from the campaign, give us something that unit histories and campaign accounts cannot quite provide: the texture of what this was like from the inside. Sergeant Bourgogne of the Imperial Guard Grenadier, one of the most famous memoirists of the campaign, left a record of the retreat that is vivid and precise in its detail. He describes the physical reality of marching in extreme cold, the way ice formed in his beard and moustache from his own breath, the way his feet in their worn boots lost feeling by midday and never quite regained it overnight, the constant search for firewood to build a night camp, the eating of whatever could be found, horse meat, leather from abandoned equipment, occasionally something more recognizable as food. He describes the camaraderie that developed among small groups of soldiers, the way men who had barely known each other's names during the advance became inseparable companions on the retreat, sharing the single blanket or captured Russian sheepskin, taking turns carrying the wounded man in their small group, trading jokes so feeble from cold and exhaustion that they made even less sense than usual but made people laugh anyway, because laughter was the only warmth left. He describes finding bodies in the snow, French soldiers who had simply sat down and not gotten up again, or who had died in the night in the improvised shelters the army made wherever it stopped. He describes his own moments of near despair, when the cold and the hunger and the endless march made the idea of simply lying down in the snow seem almost attractive, and how he forced himself forward, one step and then another, fixing his eyes on the man in front of him and simply following. He survived. Many did not. His memoir is one of the great documents of human endurance. Captain Charles Francois, an infantry officer, wrote of a night near Smolensk on the retreat when his regiment bivouacked in the open without shelter, in temperatures of approximately -25 degrees Celsius. He described how the men built fires from whatever they could find, pieces of abandoned wagons, fence posts from a nearby village, anything combustible, and crowded around them so tightly that those on the outer edge of the circle were being burned by the fire, while those on the outer edge of the circle were freezing. Every few minutes the circle would rotate, each man moving from heat to cold and back to heat, so that at any given moment half of them were simultaneously too hot and half too cold. In the morning, when the regiment formed up to march, they counted the losses from that single night. 47 men had died in the bivouac, most from the cold, some from injuries, 1 or 2 from causes that were hard to determine. 47 men, not in battle, not from the enemy, but simply from a single winter night in Russia. Among the Russian soldiers and civilians, there were equally remarkable stories. The Russian soldiers in Kutuzov's army, following the retreating French through the winter, were in far better condition than their enemies, better fed, better clothed, better supplied, operating in a landscape they understood. But they were not comfortable, and their campaign was not without its own hardships. The Russian winters were harsh for Russians too. The long marches through snow and cold exhausted men and horses. The constant fighting, the skirmishes and ambushes, and the occasional major engagement cost lives steadily. What sustained them, more than anything else, was the knowledge that they were defending their home. This is not an abstract or sentimental observation. It had very concrete effects on how men fought and how much they were willing to endure. The Russian soldier fighting near Moscow was fighting for his city, his church, his family somewhere to the east. The French soldier fighting the same battle was fighting for something much harder to define from this distance. Loyalty to a commander, the habits of a military career, perhaps a fading sense of national glory. The Russian civilians who had fled before the French advance were, in many cases, in desperate condition. Tens of thousands of people had left their homes with almost nothing, fleeing into the Russian interior in the late summer and early autumn, when the news of the French advance reached them. They lived in forests, in improvised shelters, in the towns and villages that had not yet been affected by the fighting. Food was often scarce. The autumn was cold. The children especially suffered. And yet the Russian peasantry showed, throughout this period, a remarkable collective resolve. They burned their own crops and homes when ordered to, and sometimes when not ordered to, simply refusing to let the French have anything. They sheltered their priests and their icons, the sacred images that were the centre of Russian Orthodox religious life, sometimes burying them in the forest, sometimes carrying them deep into the interior. They maintained, in the middle of chaos, a sense of community and identity and faith that the war could bend but could not break. The role of women in the 1812 campaign is a chapter that has often been told in fragments, but deserves to be assembled. Among the French and Allied forces, there were many thousands of women, the wives and companions of officers, the cantinières, female soldiers who served as suppliers and nurses in the field, and various camp followers who had attached themselves to the army in France or Poland and had marched all the way to Moscow. These women faced all the same hardships as the soldiers on the retreat, and many of them died on the road. The cantinières in particular, tough, experienced campaign women who'd been with the army through many campaigns, faced the retreat with a matter-of-fact courage that was remarked upon by many of the male soldiers they travelled with. Among the Russians, women were most visible in the role of refugees, mothers carrying children, young women who had lost their husbands in the fighting, grandmothers walking east with whatever could be fitted into a small bundle. But there were also Russian women who participated more directly in the resistance. The story of Nadezhda Durova, a young noblewoman who disguised herself as a man and served as a cavalry officer in the Russian army. She'd been doing this since 1806 and would continue until 1816, is one of the most extraordinary individual stories of the entire Napoleonic era. She fought at Borodino and in subsequent actions, and wrote a famous memoir of her service that was later published, with the encouragement of the great Russian poet Pushkin. More commonly, Russian women participated in the resistance through the partisan activity that I mentioned earlier, hiding soldiers in their homes, providing food and information to Russian forces, and sometimes taking a more direct role in harassing and attacking isolated French soldiers. The stories of individual peasant women who organised resistance in their villages, who hid fugitives, who refused to give information to French questioners no matter what threats were made, are numerous in the Russian sources and have a quiet heroism that is easy to overlook but important to remember. The impact on the animals of Russia, not just the military horses but the ordinary animals of the countryside, deserves a moment too, because it speaks to how total the disruption of 1812 was. The dogs of Moscow, which was a city of many dogs in normal times, became a subject of some observation in the accounts of French soldiers occupying the burned city. With most of the population gone, the dogs had been left behind. Thousands of them, suddenly without owners or food. They survived initially on the bodies of horses and the scraps of the occupation. By the time the French retreated, they had formed into large packs and were living in the ruins. Some accounts describe these packs following the retreating French army west, living on the bodies of horses and men who died on the road. A grim image that has stayed with historians as a symbol of how completely the normal order of things had been disrupted. The livestock that had not been driven away from the western Russian provinces by the retreating Russian forces was often eaten by the French during the advance. The cattle and sheep and pigs that formed the subsistence basis of Russian peasant agriculture were gone from vast areas. When the Russian peasants returned to their villages after the French had passed, they often found themselves with nothing. No grain, no livestock, no tools, no food stores for the coming winter. The result was a famine in some areas that killed perhaps as many civilians as the war itself had killed soldiers. Let us turn now to one of the most humanly interesting and historically significant aspects of the 1812 campaign. What happened to the men on both sides who were captured? The French soldiers captured by Russian forces during the campaign faced a situation that varied enormously depending on when and how they were captured. Those captured early in the campaign, before the full scale of the catastrophe was apparent, were generally treated in accordance with the accepted conventions of European warfare, held as prisoners, eventually exchanged or released at the end of hostilities. Several French officers who were captured in the summer of 1812 spent relatively comfortable captivities in Russian country houses, living as guests of Russian noble families, learning Russian, reading Russian books, and in some cases forming friendships with their hosts that outlasted the war. But those captured during the retreat, especially in December, were in a very different situation. Many were so badly debilitated by cold and hunger that they could barely walk. The Russian army had no facilities to hold large numbers of prisoners in the winter field, and the POW camps established further east were overwhelmed with numbers. Prisoners who survived the immediate capture, not all did, faced an uncertain journey east through the Russian winter to whatever captivity awaited them. Of the approximately 150,000 French and Allied soldiers taken prisoner during the 1812 campaign, only a fraction ever returned home. Exact numbers are difficult to establish, but it is generally estimated that perhaps 100,000 prisoners died in Russia, from their wounds, from illness, from the cold and hunger of captivity, from the general disruption that the war had caused to the normal functioning of Russian society. The survivors of Russian captivity were a long time coming home. Some were not repatriated until the 1810s, some not until years after Napoleon's final defeat in 1815. Some French soldiers who survived captivity chose to stay in Russia. They had been there long enough to learn the language, form relationships, build lives. Russia was large enough and empty enough in many places that a skilled tradesman or a literate former officer could find a place. Russian noble families who had kept French tutors and servants for their children before the war. French culture had been enormously fashionable in Russian aristocratic circles, sometimes employed their former enemies as tutors or household staff. A small but historically interesting French origin community persisted in Russia for generations. Alexander's response to Napoleon's overtures during the occupation of Moscow is one of the most revealing episodes of the whole campaign, and it deserves careful attention. Napoleon sent 3 separate diplomatic missions to Alexander during the weeks in Moscow, each one more urgent than the last. The most significant was a message carried by General Lauriston, one of Napoleon's aides-de-camp, who was sent to the Russian advance headquarters to request an audience with the Tsar. Kutuzov, who received Lauriston, would not allow him to proceed to St. Petersburg. He told him, politely but firmly, that he had no instructions from the Tsar to receive any French diplomatic mission. He was not in a position to open peace negotiations. He suggested that Lauriston might write to the Tsar. Lauriston wrote. He received no reply. Alexander's silence was not accidental or bureaucratic. It was a deliberate, considered choice. He had made a private oath. Some accounts say he made it in prayer, in a moment of genuine spiritual commitment, that he would not negotiate with Napoleon as long as there was a single French soldier on Russian soil. He had told his closest advisers that he would rather retreat to Siberia than make peace with Napoleon. He was not bluffing. The reason this matters is that Napoleon's entire strategy for the campaign depended on the assumption that taking Moscow would force Alexander to negotiate. Every decision Napoleon had made since crossing the Niemen, the decision to keep advancing past Smolensk, the decision to fight at Borodino, the decision to wait in Moscow through September and October, had been made on the assumption that eventually, somehow, Alexander would come to the table. Alexander never came to the table. It was the most consequential act of personal will in the entire campaign. One man's refusal to do what all strategic logic seemed to demand, the refusal of the ruler of a country whose ancient capital had just been captured and burned to discuss terms with the conqueror, changed the history of the world. The aftermath of the 1812 campaign unfolded over the following 3 years in ways that changed Europe permanently. Napoleon returned to Paris in December 1812 and immediately began the work of rebuilding his military power. He was, as always, astonishingly energetic. Within months he had raised new armies, appointed new commanders, begun new campaigns. He was not done yet. But something had changed. The aura of invincibility that had surrounded Napoleon and his armies for more than a decade was gone. The army that had seemed unstoppable, that had beaten everyone it faced, had been destroyed, not in battle, not by a superior enemy, but by the Russian land and the Russian climate and the Russian people's refusal to be conquered. If Napoleon could be destroyed in Russia, perhaps he could be beaten elsewhere. Perhaps the system of military and political dominance he had built across Europe was not as permanent as it had seemed. Prussia was the first to act. The Convention of Tauroggen, signed in December 1812, was the beginning. By February 1813, Prussia had formally declared war on France. Austria, which had been a reluctant French ally in the Russian campaign, began moving toward the coalition against Napoleon. Sweden, Russia, and Britain were already committed. The War of the Sixth Coalition, the great combined effort that would ultimately defeat Napoleon, was forming. The battles of 1813, the Spring Campaign, the Summer Armistice, the Autumn Campaign that climaxed at the Battle of Leipzig in October 1813, were all made possible by the destruction of the Grande Armée in Russia. Napoleon no longer had the vast reservoir of experienced veterans that had been his greatest military asset. He was fighting with armies of conscripts, brave, often, but inexperienced, lacking the discipline and tactical skill that had made his earlier armies so formidable. Leipzig, the Battle of the Nations, fought over 3 days in October 1813, the largest battle in world history to that date, ended with Napoleon's forces driven out of Germany. France itself was invaded in early 1814. Paris fell in March. Napoleon abdicated in April. He would return for the 100 Days in 1815, would fight his last battle at Waterloo, would be defeated and exiled to St. Helena, where he would die in 1821. But the road to all of this, the road that led from the triumph of Austerlitz in 1805 to the exile of St. Helena, ran through the Russian plain in 1812, through the smoke of burning Moscow and the frozen waters of the Berezina and the snow-covered road west from the greatest city in Russia. The impact of the 1812 campaign on Russia itself was profound and lasting. For the Russian people, the War of 1812, they called it the Patriotic War, the Otechestvenaya Vojna, became one of the defining moments of national identity. It was the moment when Russia had been invaded by the greatest military power in the world, had suffered enormous losses and destruction, and had ultimately prevailed through a combination of military strategy, personal sacrifice, and what Russians understood as a kind of divine protection. The burning of Moscow, which might have seemed a catastrophic humiliation, was reimagined in the national memory as a noble sacrifice. The city burned by patriotic Russians themselves rather than surrendered. Alexander himself was transformed by the campaign. He had entered 1812 as a complicated, ambiguous figure, liberal-leaning in some ways, autocratic in others, personally conflicted about his legitimacy and his role. He emerged from the destruction of Napoleon's army as something more definite, a sovereign who had stood firm when most of Europe had submitted to Napoleon, who had refused to negotiate when every calculation of advantage suggested he should, who had been vindicated by events in a way that felt to him, and to many Russians, like a kind of providence. The Tsar became, in the years after 1812, increasingly religious, and increasingly convinced that his victory over Napoleon had a spiritual dimension, that Russia had been chosen to deliver Europe from a kind of Antichrist figure. This conviction would lead him in various directions, some positive, his role in organizing the post-Napoleonic international order, some problematic, his eventual turn toward conservatism and mysticism. but its source was the experience of 1812. For the Russian aristocracy and educated class, the Patriotic War had another kind of significance. It had brought them into direct contact with the Russian common people, the serfs, the peasants, the ordinary soldiers, in a way that was unusual and, for some, transformative. Young nobles who had grown up in the gilded world of St. Petersburg high society found themselves marching alongside and fighting alongside men from a world completely different from their own, men of extraordinary physical toughness and simple faith. Some of these young nobles came away with a new sense of who the Russian people really were, and with a discomfort about the institution of serfdom that had kept those same people in bondage. The Decembrist uprising of 1825, Russia's first organised attempt at a liberal political revolution, led by a group of young army officers, was in many ways a product of the 1812 generation, men who had seen Napoleon's defeat and the liberation of Europe and could not understand why Russia, which had done so much to achieve that liberation, remained a country in which millions of people were the property of other people. For France and for the rest of Europe, the lesson of 1812 was simpler but no less profound. The lesson was that there were limits, that even the most powerful military force in history had limits, that geography and climate and the will of a people to defend their home could defeat any army, no matter how well organised and how brilliantly led, that there were things that could not be conquered by force alone. The military lessons were studied intensively for decades afterward. Every major European and American military academy examined the 1812 campaign in detail, looking for what could be learned about supply logistics, about the relationship between army size and operational capability, about the vulnerabilities of extended supply lines, about the effectiveness of scorched-earth tactics and guerrilla warfare. Karl von Clausewitz, the great Prussian military theorist, who had served in the Russian army during the 1812 campaign as a liaison officer, developed many of his ideas about the nature of war from what he had observed that year. His masterwork, On War, published after his death, drew directly on the Russian experience to develop its arguments about the fog of war, about the role of chance and uncertainty in military operations, about the limits of what strategic planning could accomplish. The idea of strategic depth, the concept that a country with vast territory can trade space for time, drawing an enemy deep into an unfamiliar and hostile interior until he is exhausted and vulnerable, was not new in 1812, but the Russian campaign gave it its most dramatic and convincing demonstration. Military planners for generations afterward would cite 1812 when thinking about the challenge of invading Russia. They would need to remember these lessons in the 20th century, when two separate European powers, Germany in 1941 and Germany again in a different way, would confront the same fundamental challenge of the Russian space and the Russian climate and the Russian will. The echoes of 1812 would sound very loudly in the frozen winter of 1941-42, when the German army, which had driven deep into Russia in the summer, found itself stalled before Moscow as the temperature dropped and the Soviets counterattacked. History does not repeat itself exactly, but it echoes. One of the most extraordinary literary consequences of the 1812 campaign was the creation of Leo Tolstoy's War and Peace. Tolstoy was born in 1828, 16 years after the campaign. He grew up in a Russia where 1812 was living memory for many people, where old soldiers and old women and old generals still told their stories of that year, where the burned ruins of villages and the crosses on soldiers' graves were still visible in the landscape. He was a member of the Russian nobility, the class that had provided so many of the officers and commanders of the patriotic war, and he grew up surrounded by family stories and family connections to the events of 1812. He also did something that very few historical novelists do. He researched his subject exhaustively. He read memoirs, letters, official dispatches, regimental histories. He visited Borodino Field and walked it in all weathers, trying to understand how the battle had unfolded. He interviewed survivors. He steeped himself in the material until he could imagine it from the inside. The result was one of the greatest novels ever written, a book that is many things at once: a love story, a family saga, a philosophical meditation on the meaning of history, a military chronicle of the 1812 campaign, and an attempt to understand what historical forces really are and how they work. Tolstoy's Napoleon in War and Peace is not the heroic conqueror of the French tradition. He is a small, vain, bewildered man, carried along by forces he does not understand and cannot control, believing in his own power and intelligence while events unfold entirely independently of his will. Tolstoy's Kutuzov is the opposite, a man who understands that he cannot control events, who simply waits and watches and tries not to interfere with what the historical forces will do on their own, and whose wisdom lies precisely in this patient, apparently passive observation. The philosophical argument embedded in War and Peace, that historical events are not the product of great men's decisions, but of millions of individual human actions too small and too numerous to control or predict, is one of the most interesting and provocative ideas in the novel, and it was inspired directly by Tolstoy's meditation on the 1812 campaign. Why had Napoleon lost? Not because Kutuzov was cleverer, Tolstoy argues, not because Alexander was braver or more determined, but because the Russian people, in their millions, had collectively decided that they would not be conquered, and that collective decision expressed itself in 10,000 individual acts of resistance, endurance and sacrifice that no single commander or emperor could have organized or controlled. The physical landscape of the 1812 campaign today is mostly peaceful. If you travel the road from Smolensk to Moscow, now a modern highway, fast and well-surfaced, nothing like the dusty track of 1812, you pass through a landscape that is in many ways not so different from what Napoleon's soldiers saw. The forests are still there, those deep, ancient birch and pine forests that seem to go on forever. The rivers are still there, smaller than you might expect from their historical importance, but still running across the landscape in their unhurried way. The plain is still broad and flat and enormously open, the sky enormous above it, the horizon seeming always just a little further away than it should be. At Borodino there is a large open-air museum. The earthwork redoubts, rebuilt, reconstructed, maintained, are still visible. The field is marked with monuments, Russian monuments, and, since the late 20th century, French monuments too, set up in a gesture of reconciliation between the two nations. The original monuments, put up in the 19th century, are massive stone columns topped with eagles and angels. The newer French monuments are simpler, quieter. Standing on the Borodino field in September, when the rye grass has been cut and the earth is still warm from the summer, and the sky is that particular deep blue that belongs to Russian autumn, it is possible to feel, very faintly, the weight of what happened there. Not in any supernatural sense. The field is peaceful, the birds sing, occasional tourist groups pass with their guides, but in the sense that a place where so many human beings suffered and died retains something of that suffering in itself, in the simple fact of its existence and its scale. The question of Napoleon's own psychological state during and after the Russian campaign is one that historians have approached carefully. because the evidence is complex and the man himself was so careful about what he revealed. During the retreat, Napoleon seems to have been in a strange state of suspension between his habitual confidence and a growing, unacknowledged awareness that something irreversible had happened. He continued to issue orders and make plans and maintain the posture of command, because that was what he knew how to do, and because showing weakness to his marshals and his army was unthinkable. But some of the decisions he made during the retreat, particularly the decision to leave the army early and rush back to Paris, suggest a man who understood, on some level, that there was no longer anything he could do for his soldiers. After reaching Paris in December 1812, Napoleon began the work of reconstruction with his usual astonishing energy. He raised new armies, he issued new decrees, he worked 16-hour days, but observers who were close to him in this period noticed something different about him. Not a loss of energy or intelligence, those remained, but something quieter, some spark of absolute certainty that had animated him in his early career seemed dimmer. The man who in 1805 had stood before his troops at Austerlitz and told them they would win, with a conviction that had passed from him to them like an electric current, was not quite the same man who addressed new conscripts in 1813. He remained formidable. He would fight extraordinary campaigns in 1813 and 1814, winning battles against much larger forces with the tactical brilliance that never entirely left him. But the context had changed. The manpower was gone. The prestige was damaged. The allies who might have saved him had been frightened by Russia into looking for another arrangement, and the enemies who had feared him for so long had finally found, in Russia, evidence that he could be beaten. The impact of the 1812 campaign on ordinary French society is a dimension of the story that is sometimes overlooked in accounts that focus on the military and diplomatic history. France in 1812 and 1813 was a country that had been at war almost continuously for 20 years. It had paid an enormous price in blood and treasure. The generation of men who had grown up during the Revolution and the early years of Napoleon's rule had largely been consumed by the wars. The class of 1812, the young men called up to fill the gaps left by the Russian catastrophe, was in many cases very young indeed. Boys of 17 and 18 were being pressed into service for campaigns in Germany and eventually France itself. French families whose sons and husbands had marched east in June 1812 faced months of terrible uncertainty. The official news bulletins, the famous Bulletin de la Grande Armée that Napoleon used to communicate with the French public, were carefully managed to minimize the extent of the disaster. For weeks and months after the truth was known in military headquarters, French families were receiving official communiques that spoke of difficulties and strategic withdrawals rather than catastrophe. It was only gradually as survivors began to return, emaciated, frostbitten, hollow-eyed, that the full scale of what had happened became clear to the French public. The grief was enormous and widespread. Almost every town in France had sent men to Russia. Almost every town received back fewer than it had sent, if it received any back at all. The cemeteries filled. The names on the walls of the churches multiplied. And with grief came, slowly and cautiously, the beginnings of doubt. The bulletins had lied about Russia. What else had the bulletins lied about? The emperor who had seemed invincible had sent 500,000 men to their deaths in the Russian snow. What kind of invincibility was that? These questions would not be fully answered until 1814 and 1815, when Napoleon fell and then fell again. But the seeds of doubt planted by Russia would grow steadily through those years. The Treaty of Vienna, signed in 1815 after Napoleon's final defeat, reshaped Europe in ways that the statesmen at the conference hoped would prevent another Napoleon from arising. The concert of Europe that emerged from Vienna, the system of great power cooperation and balance that would generally keep the peace in Europe for most of the 19th century, was in a very real sense built on the ruins of Napoleon's grand army in the Russian snow. The human cost of the Napoleonic Wars as a whole, from 1803 to 1815, was somewhere between 3.5 million and 6 million dead, depending on how you count and what you include. The Russian campaign of 1812 was one of the bloodiest single chapters of this era, accounting for perhaps 400,000 to 500,000 deaths on all sides, military and civilian. These are numbers that resist easy comprehension. They're not simply statistics. Each number was a person, a child who had grown up somewhere, who had been loved by someone, who had hoped for things and feared things and experienced the particular texture of their own individual life before that life ended on a dusty road near Smolensk, or in the Berezina River, or in some unnamed Russian field in the deep December cold. There is a particular story from the retreat that has always seemed to me to capture something essential about the whole experience. Not a famous battle or a grand strategic decision, but a small human moment. During the retreat near the town of Vilna in what is now Lithuania, a column of French soldiers came upon a group of Russian prisoners they had been transporting. Soldiers captured earlier in the campaign, now being dragged along in the retreat because there was no longer any way to guard them properly or provide for them separately. Some of the prisoners were barely alive, sick, frostbitten, starving. A French infantry sergeant, his name is not recorded in the accounts that describe this incident, noticed that one of the Russian prisoners, a very young soldier, was about to fall. The prisoner was perhaps 16 or 17 years old, clearly dying from cold and starvation, and had stopped walking and was swaying on his feet. The sergeant, himself exhausted and hungry, did something remarkable. He stopped, took off his own coat, and wrapped it around the Russian boy. Not a spare coat, not an extra piece of equipment. His own coat, the one he was wearing, the one that was keeping him alive. His companions tried to stop him. It was madness, they said. You'll freeze to death. The sergeant tied the coat around the Russian boy, said something to him in French that the boy almost certainly did not understand, and walked on. What happened to either of them afterward, whether the Russian boy survived or the sergeant froze or both somehow made it home, is not known. The story was told by a witness and recorded in a memoir but without names or further detail. What it tells us is something important about human beings in extremity. That even in the worst circumstances, even when self-preservation is the overwhelming imperative, people sometimes do things that cannot be explained by any calculation of advantage or survival. They do things that are simply good. They give their coat to a dying enemy because the enemy is a person, and a person is dying, and they cannot watch that happen. This impulse, this stubborn, irrational, entirely human impulse toward decency, even in the midst of horror, ran through the whole campaign on all sides. It ran through the Russian soldiers who sometimes helped wounded French prisoners, rather than leaving them to die. Through the French officers who, even during the retreat, tried to organize care for the sick and wounded rather than simply abandoning them. Through the Russian peasant families who, in some cases, sheltered sick or lost French soldiers, not out of any sympathy for the invaders, but out of a simple human response to another human being in desperate need. The history of 1812 is a story of terrible violence and terrible suffering, of strategic decisions that sent hundreds of thousands of people to their deaths, of national pride and imperial ambition, and the vast indifference of climate and geography to human plans. But it is also, running through all of that, a story of ordinary human goodness that never entirely disappeared even in the worst conditions. The Berezina River is a quiet river today. It flows through the forests of Belarus, passing through a landscape of pine and birch that in many seasons is very beautiful. The trees reflected in the dark water, the banks soft with moss, the sky above the river enormous and pale. Fishermen sit on the banks. Occasionally a boat passes. The river does not look like the scene of one of the greatest catastrophes in European history. But on the banks of the Berezina, archaeologists have found, and continue to find, the physical remnants of the crossing of 1812. Buttons, buckles, coins, fragments of weapons, the bones of horses and sometimes the bones of men, all pressed into the mud of the riverbed or the sediment of the banks, preserved by the cold water for 2 centuries. Each object is a small, silent witness to what happened here. Each bone was once part of a person who had a name and a family and a home somewhere in France or Poland or Italy or Germany. The Berezina has become, in the French language, a common noun, une Berezina. It means a complete and overwhelming catastrophe. The French use it casually today. Une Berezina in football refers to a humiliating defeat. Une Berezina in business to a total failure. The word has outlasted the empire that created it, outlasted Napoleon himself, and now lives on in ordinary speech as a trace of that terrible November in 1812 when the greatest army in the world tried to cross a cold river and could not. There is a remarkable Russian poem written in the mid-19th century by a poet named Fyodor Tyutchev that contains lines often quoted in discussions of the 1812 campaign. The poem speaks of Russia as a country that cannot be understood by reason, that can only be believed in, a place that operates by principles that logic cannot quite reach. Whether or not you accept the mystical claim embedded in those lines, and reasonable people disagree about whether nations have mystical destinies or simply complex histories, the 1812 campaign does seem to demonstrate something true and important about Russia, that it is a different kind of place from Western Europe in ways that matter militarily, geographically, climatically, and culturally. That the same assumptions and the same strategies that work elsewhere do not always work in Russia. That Russia has a capacity for absorbing punishment and continuing to resist, a capacity rooted in geography and climate and something harder to define, that has surprised invaders repeatedly over the centuries. Charles XII of Sweden had discovered this in 1709, when his army was destroyed at Poltava after a terrible winter in the Ukrainian steppe. Hitler's Germany would discover it again in 1941-42, when the German advance stalled in the mud and snow before Moscow and Leningrad and Stalingrad, and the Soviet counter-offensive began. History does not repeat exactly, but certain truths about certain places tend to reassert themselves across the centuries. The final accounting of the 1812 campaign involves numbers that are difficult to hold in the mind all at once. Of the approximately 610,000 men who entered Russia in June 1812, perhaps 100,000 were killed in battle or died immediately of battle wounds. Another 200,000 to 250,000 died of disease, starvation, and cold, deaths that were not glorious, not commemorated with monuments, not counted in the official casualty lists for years afterward. Perhaps 150,000 were taken prisoner, of whom perhaps 100,000 died in captivity. The rest, perhaps 60,000 to 80,000, survived and made their way home. The horses, roughly 180,000 entered Russia. Perhaps 15,000 came out. The artillery, approximately 1,400 guns entered Russia. Fewer than 250 came out. The supply wagons entered Russia in the thousands. Most were abandoned on the roads of the retreat. The treasure, enormous quantities of gold, silver, and other valuables looted from Moscow were loaded onto the retreat wagons. Most of this was lost. Wagons abandoned in the snow, horses dying and their loads scattered, men dropping what they were carrying when they could carry it no further. The great cross of Ivan the Great that Napoleon stripped from the Kremlin bell tower was supposedly abandoned somewhere near Smolensk and has never been found, though people have searched for it for 2 centuries. And the human stories, the letters unwritten, the families unvisited, the harvest not brought in, the children not seen, the ordinary lives not lived, these cannot be quantified at all. What can we draw from this story, as we followed it from the bright June morning on the Niemen to the grey December roads of the retreat? The first and most obvious lesson is about the dangers of overconfidence. Napoleon, who had every reason to be confident, who had won battle after battle, who commanded the greatest army ever assembled, let that confidence lead him past the point where strategic prudence would have counselled stopping. He kept going east when he should have turned back. He kept waiting in Moscow when he should have left weeks earlier. His confidence in his own ability to control events, his belief that one more push would bring the result he wanted, cost hundreds of thousands of lives and ultimately his empire. The second lesson is about the importance of knowing your enemy's character. Napoleon understood battlefields. He understood armies. He did not quite understand Alexander, did not understand the particular quality of the Tsar's stubborn, spiritual, almost fatalistic determination not to negotiate. He expected Alexander to behave the way European monarchs generally behaved when their capitals were captured, to negotiate, to accept terms, to be realistic. Alexander was not being realistic. He was being something else, something that Napoleon, for all his genius, could not quite calculate. The third lesson is about the relationship between armies and the land they move through. An army of 600,000 men is not more powerful than the land it crosses. It is dependent on it. It needs to eat. It needs to drink. It needs roads. It needs bridges. It needs all the infrastructure of a settled agricultural civilization. Take that away, burn the crops, drive away the animals, empty the villages, and the army becomes a vast, hungry, dying thing that cannot sustain itself. The fourth lesson is about time and patience. Kutuzov won the campaign by waiting, by not fighting when the instinct was to fight, by refusing to give Napoleon the battle he needed, by accepting the cost of retreating in order to preserve the ability to resist. It was profoundly unpopular. It looked, from the outside, like weakness. It was the opposite. And the fifth lesson, perhaps the deepest, is about what makes a people resistant to conquest. The Russian people in 1812, the peasants and the soldiers and the aristocrats and the merchants and the priests, were not simply defending a government or an empire or a strategic interest. They were defending their home, their churches, their families, their language, their way of life. This is not a sentiment that can be mapped on a strategic plan or quantified in an order of battle, but it is real and it is powerful, and the history of 1812 is one of the great demonstrations of how powerful it can be. As the long story of 1812 comes toward its quiet ending, there is something consoling to rest on: the remarkable fact of recovery. Moscow, which was 2/3 burned in September 1812, was being rebuilt within a year. The Russian spirit of reconstruction was extraordinary. Not just the grand neoclassical buildings that the Tsar's architects designed for the new Moscow, but the thousands of ordinary wooden houses rebuilt by ordinary Muscovites who had returned to their city and found it in ruins and simply began, one plank and one beam at a time, to rebuild it. By 1820, Moscow was largely restored. By 1825, it had surpassed its pre-war population. The Cathedral of Christ the Saviour, begun in 1839 as a memorial to the Patriotic War, would eventually rise on the banks of the Moscow River, a vast white building visible from much of the city, a monument to the people and soldiers who had defended Russia in 1812. That cathedral has its own complicated history, demolished in the Stalin era and rebuilt again in the 1990s, but it stands today, a quiet reminder of what the year 1812 meant to Russia. The soldiers who survived the retreat, French, German, Polish, Italian, and all the rest, came home changed by what they had experienced in ways that can be read in their faces in the portraits painted of them in their later years, in the memoirs they wrote when they were old men trying to make sense of what they had lived through, in the silences that their descendants would later describe, when they asked the old men about Russia, and the old men would simply look away. The survivors came home and they planted gardens. They had children. They watched their children grow up in a Europe that was, after 1815, more peaceful than it had been in a generation. Some of them became farmers, merchants, craftsmen. Some remained in the army and fought other wars. A few wrote books, most lived quietly. The great Russian plain that they had crossed in June 1812 with such confidence, and recrossed in December with such desperation, was quiet again. The grass grew back over the burned fields. The birch trees leafed out each spring in their gentle, trembling way. The rivers ran as they had always run, carrying their cold, dark water west toward the Baltic and the sea. The stars came out over Russia each night, as they always had. Those sharp, close Russian stars, more brilliant out here on the open plain than anywhere to the west, hanging in the enormous dome of the Russian sky with a kind of patient constancy that made all human events seem, from their perspective, very small and very brief. The plain was there before Napoleon, and it was there after him, and it will be there long after every army and every emperor and every record of their passing has returned to dust. For the children of the survivors, French children who grew up listening to fragments of stories about the cold and the snow and the long road home, Russian children who were told about the burning of Moscow and the great battle at Borodino, Polish children who were told about fathers who had crossed the Niemen hoping for the restoration of their nation, and had not come back. The year 1812 was a story received at second hand, made of silences as much as words. But it was a story that shaped them, the knowledge that one's father had survived something that destroyed hundreds of thousands of other men, the knowledge that one's country had faced the most powerful military force in the world and had not been destroyed, the knowledge that somewhere, in a field near Borodino or by the banks of the Berezina, a person who shared your blood had stood in the snow and done whatever they could. These are the kinds of knowledge that travel down through families for generations, losing detail and gaining myth, becoming eventually not memory at all but something more like character, a particular quality of toughness, a particular awareness of how quickly things can change, a particular respect for the indifference of the natural world. The Russian winter does not care about empires. The Russian plain does not care about the ambitions of generals. The Berezina River does not care about the treaties that are signed by great men in comfortable rooms 1,000 miles away. They simply are what they are, and they were what they were in 1812, and they will be what they are long after all of us have become part of the same gentle, indifferent, eternally patient earth. The great silences of history are as important as its loud moments. The silence of the Russian plain in the days after the French army had passed, the silence of burned villages and empty fields, and the first snow falling on roads rutted by the passage of hundreds of thousands of feet and wheels and hooves. The silence of the Moscow night in September, when the fires finally burned low and the city lay in its ruins under a sky full of stars, and the sounds of military occupation replaced the sounds of a living city. The silence of the Berezina river bank in late November, after the crossing was finished and the last of the survivors had staggered west, and the river ran quietly on over its cold pebbles, indifferent and unchanging. These silences are part of the story too. They are the spaces between the noise and the chaos and the recorded events, and within them something essential about what happened in 1812 can be heard. Not the voice of generals or emperors, but something simpler and older. The voice of the land itself, which had been crossed by armies and set on fire and burdened with the weight of human ambition, and was now, quietly and patiently, returning to itself. The birch leaves fallen in autumn rot slowly into the dark Russian soil. The bones of horses and men, left by the retreating army in the winter fields and forests, are absorbed into the same soil over generations. The very molecules of those lost soldiers become, in time, part of the Russian earth, grass and trees and the bodies of animals, cycling through the great slow breathing of a landscape that will outlast all the stories ever told about it. And so the story of Napoleon and the Grand Armée in Russia comes to its quiet ending, not with a battle or a treaty or a proclamation, but with the return of ordinary time. The summer comes again to the Russian plain. The fields fill with grain and wildflowers. The rivers run clear and cold from their northern sources. The forest understory in the birchwoods is full of mushrooms after the autumn rains, and the mushroom gatherers go out in the early morning mist to collect them, their baskets growing heavy as the morning wears on. The soldiers are gone. The fires are out. The road from Moscow to Smolensk is empty of armies, carrying only the ordinary traffic of ordinary life. Farmers with carts, merchants with packages, pilgrims walking to some distant shrine. The Kremlin towers are still standing above the Moscow River, their domes catching the morning light as they have caught it for centuries and will catch it for centuries more. The Assumption Cathedral, which survived the fire, receives its congregation for Sunday morning prayers. The bells ring out across the rooftops and the river, carrying that particular quality of Russian bell sound, deep and resonant and slightly melancholy, that has been ringing out over Russian cities since before any of the people in this story were born. The great Russian plain stretches away to the south and east and north, enormous and patient and alive, under a sky so vast and clear that on certain mornings in early summer you can feel, standing in the middle of it, that you're standing at the centre of the world. This is the country that defeated Napoleon. Not through any single brilliant strategic stroke, not through any one great battle, but through the accumulated weight of all of itself, its size, its climate, its people's determination, its ancient capacity for endurance, its forests and its rivers and its cold and its vast unhurried sky. It is a remarkable country. And 1812 is a remarkable story, not just of military history and imperial ambition and political calculation, but of what human beings are capable of when they are pushed to the very edge of what they can endure, and what happens when the ambition of one extraordinary man finally meets something larger and older, and more patient than ambition. The Russian plain is still there as it has always been. The stars come out over it each night, as they always have, and the story of what happened there in that long, terrible year is kept alive by those who tell it and those who listen, carried forward from voice to voice, from year to year, across the quiet distance of time